For years, my parents always favored my brother, Craig, the golden child, while they disowned me for my ambition to start a business. Now at 29, I find my company thriving, while my brother at 31 has lost his job. So recently, my parents reached out and their request was clear. They wanted me to help my brother. Craig had always been the one who excelled academically and in every other way. My parents never missed a chance to remind me of it, constantly urging me to keep up. He got into an excellent college, and 5 years ago he made history by becoming the youngest vice president in his company. He was doing exceptionally well, which only amplified their comparisons of our achievements. Despite their incessant pressure, I wasn't interested in a traditional 9-to-5 job. My true passion lay in entrepreneurship, a dream I embraced from a young age. After years of working in various roles to gain industry experience, I finally decided to launch my own line of modern, edgy car accessories. I thought that after they had celebrated Craig's promotion, my parents might be more supportive when I shared my plans, but their response shocked me. Instead of encouragement or constructive feedback, they laughed and dismissed my dream as a joke and embarrassing venture after investing years in my education. They sharply advised me against leaving my job, fearing that I would bring disgrace upon the family. I was deeply offended and stood my ground, insisting that I would pursue my business, with or without their backing. Their cold response revealed their true feelings. They threatened to cut me out of their lives if I followed through, stating they couldn't bear the thought of introducing their successful son alongside me, who was still trying to find my footing. Faced with such a choice, it became clear I had to prioritize my ambitions. I chose to sever ties with my family that day, never looking back. Craig, aligning himself with their views, took their side, but to be honest, I was okay with that. He had always struck me as overly arrogant, which made it easy for me to distance myself from him from the very start. My longtime passion for cars inspired my business idea, and I had complete faith in it. I recognized a genuine demand for my concept and was determined to prove my parents wrong, so I dove in headfirst. I left my job to chase my aspirations. In hindsight, I realized that was a risky decision I shouldn't approach with pride. It's not something I'd recommend to anyone. Yet it worked out for me. Within a few months, I secured some investors and launched my own business. The beginning was tough. I was living paycheck to paycheck and relied solely on word-of-mouth marketing, which slowly brought in more customers. After about a year and a half, things really began to accelerate, and there was no looking back. I'm now quite comfortable living in a nice apartment in a great neighborhood with a decent car. While I wouldn't classify myself as a millionaire, I'm doing well enough and certainly don't feel like a failure, contrary to my parents' expectations. So in many ways, I've managed to prove them wrong, and that brings me happiness. In fact, I've been so content that I haven't felt the need to involve them in my life anymore. It's been 5 years since we last spoke. I even married my girlfriend of 8 years, and just last month, we discovered that we're expecting a child. I've celebrated many milestones, but I've never reached out to my parents. They know how to find me. Any relative could point them in my direction. I've kept in touch with the rest of the family, and they often let me know that my parents inquire about me but make no effort to reconnect. Last week, however, they finally reached out and asked if I'd be willing to meet. After discussing it with my wife, who encouraged me to go, I decided to visit them, even though their message left me apprehensive. Upon my arrival, they greeted me warmly, but I could sense an underlying tension. Their previous demeanor had never been this friendly, and as we engaged in small talk, it felt like they were building up to something. Eventually, they addressed the matter at hand. They had heard about my business and wanted to congratulate me. While they didn't apologize, they expressed their happiness that I had succeeded and acknowledged their earlier doubts. I simply smiled in response, unsure of what else to say. Then they shared some news about Craig, conveying that he had been going through a rough patch recently. It turned out that his company had faced significant layoffs, leading to his termination. For the last 4 months, he had been at home, struggling to find work and feeling down about his situation. I found it really perplexing that they were discussing my brother, especially since there wasn't much I could do at that moment. I decided to let them continue, curious about where the conversation would lead. Eventually, they got to the point and asked if I would consider hiring my brother, explaining that he felt too depressed to apply for jobs himself, and that the offers he received were below his qualifications. Clearly, he was in need, and my parents wanted to know if I could offer him a well-paying position at my company, where he could contribute his expertise. When they posed the question, I was taken aback and told them I needed time to think it over, consciously sidestepping a direct yes because I was unsure how to respond. In hindsight, I should have realized they wouldn't have reached out without a reason, especially since they hadn't done so in the past. They seemed quite pleased, almost expecting me to agree. After returning home and discussing it with my wife, who works at a bank and isn't directly involved with my business, I leaned towards declining. She advised me that this was a professional matter and ultimately, my decision should prevail. If I felt we wouldn't work well together, that needed to be respected. Moreover, she sensed that my parents weren't being entirely sincere in their approach to reconcile, so I had no obligation to fulfill their request. I hadn't even committed to helping, so I didn't owe them anything in that regard. I intended to keep my decision to myself, knowing that a no would likely prompt them to paint me as the villain, which I wanted to avoid. However, they began texting me daily demanding an answer, and I even chose to ignore those messages. Then, 2 days ago, they called to insist on a response. After careful consideration, I told them I had decided against hiring Craig. Our relationship had never been strong, and I felt no obligation to bring him on board. Their reaction was explosive. They screamed at me, recounting everything they had done for me, from raising me to funding my childhood wants. They accused me of turning my back when they expected me to return the favor. I found that accusation deeply unfair. They had raised me not out of obligation but necessity, and it seemed unjust to expect me to feel indebted in this situation. That wasn't even the crux of the matter. I tried to explain that my decision stemmed solely from my belief that we wouldn't work well together, and their angry outburst was unwarranted. After 5 years of little communication following their lack of faith in me and refusal to invest in my business, they had no right to pressure me. In the end, I stood firm in my decision, knowing it was about professional compatibility, not a personal betrayal. But they kept yelling at me, claiming they only reached out because they thought enough time had passed for me to let things go. They insisted that since I seemed to be doing well, I was being petty by holding on to past grudges and refusing to support my own family. They reminded me that Craig was my brother, and now that he was in trouble, I needed to be there for him. They even said he would have done the same for me had our roles been reversed. They argued that if my business had failed, they would have supported me, so I owed it to them to reciprocate now. The conversation turned chaotic and emotions ran high, and eventually I told them I didn't want to talk anymore. I hung up and blocked their numbers. Since then, I've been grappling with my feelings, especially after what my parents said about helping Craig. I discussed it with my wife, who pointed out that they're only saying these things because I'm not in the same position as Craig, and they're trying to manipulate me. She reminded me that they haven't even apologized to me yet, and still expect my help. Growing up, my brother was never kind to me, and I was bullied by others. I know my wife is right, yet I can't shake this lingering guilt. Am I wrong for refusing to hire my brother after he lost his corporate job? Update 1. Thank you for your responses to my post. It's been a while since I last spoke to my parents, and now I realize that my actions weren't as significant as they're making them out to be. It's not like my brother will never work again, I just don't want to collaborate with him personally. My wife and I have decided to stick to our choice, but my parents aren't taking it well. They've been spreading rumors that I'm jealous of my brother, suggesting I'm delighting in undermining the family. I find it baffling how hard they're taking this, especially since they're reaching out to every relative about it. They're actively texting them to discuss me, even if those relatives might not have engaged otherwise. It feels absurd, and I suspect it's a ploy for attention, but I refuse to give in. They've been blocked, and there's no way I'm unblocking them to discuss this. To some relatives who reached out, I explained the whole situation and reassured them that it's not like they didn't know about the tension. We've seen each other at family events for the past 5 years without communicating. Most relatives are aware of our strained relationship, but this behavior crosses a line, trying to involve others and paint me as the villain. After clarifying things, many relatives reassured me not to worry about my parents. They won't turn against me as they understand the past and recognize my parents are simply overreacting now. That's what's keeping me grounded. Plus, my wife is pregnant, so I don't have the luxury of time to dwell on this. I've been contemplating announcing the pregnancy in a couple of weeks, but I might move it up just to send a message to my parents to stop bothering me. I think it's a good idea, but I'm honestly unsure if it'll work out. Considering my parents' heartless nature, they might even try to cause trouble for us, knowing that my wife is pregnant. I wouldn't put it past them, that's for sure. Update 2. Hey there. A couple of days ago, my wife and I made our pregnancy announcement on social media. It's been about 10 days since I last spoke to my parents. Most of my family reached out to congratulate us, but then I received an email from an unknown sender claiming that my child would suffer because of my actions toward our family. I instantly recognized it as my parents' doing. No one else would write something so cruel. My baby isn't even born yet, and they're already wishing us harm just because I declined to help my brother. It's not like Craig even approached me for assistance. It was my parents who insisted that I should give him a job. That's besides the point. Even if I had done something truly terrible, it wouldn't justify their words. I didn't tell my wife about the email because I didn't want to upset her. She's in the early stages of her pregnancy, and I find it disappointing to read things like that. I decided to handle this on my own and went to my parents' house to confront them in person since I didn't want to unblock them. Unfortunately, they refused to open the door, likely because they knew what they did was wrong. So I ended up shouting at them from outside. I told them they had no right to say such things, especially after their treatment of me throughout my childhood and in the past 5 years when they treated me like I didn't belong. Now that I'm moderately successful, they want a share of my success and expect me to help Craig, even though they never forced him to pitch in when I was struggling. They weren't there for me back then, so they have no right to speak to me now. I also pointed out that their actions were only pushing me further away. I made it clear that I never wanted to talk to them again, and even if they apologize, I wouldn't forgive them, till they could forget about any support from me when they retire, and would never meet their grandchild either. After that exchange, I returned home feeling a weight lifted off my shoulders. I had been holding these feelings in for far too long, and it was finally time I stood up to them. I haven't mentioned this conversation to my wife yet. I don't want to stress her out, especially during her pregnancy. Update 3. Hi again. After my confrontation with my parents last week, they decided to stay out of sight for a while. I hosted a pregnancy announcement party at my house for family and close friends, expecting them to pull some stunt that day. Surprisingly, they didn't show up, which made me think they had moved on from this whole situation. I was trying to do the same until I received a call from Craig this morning. While I was at work, that was quite odd because he completely stopped talking to us 5 years ago, and I had no clue what he wanted to discuss. For a moment I feared he might approach me like my parents, demanding that I give him a job, forcing me to relive that whole ordeal. So I ignored his first call, but then he called a few more times and even messaged me, saying it was urgent, and that he needed to talk. Finally, he assured me there was nothing to worry about. He wasn't going to ask anything of me. He simply wanted to talk about something that had been weighing on his mind for quite some time. After some consideration, I decided to take the call, and we spoke today. He explained that he had been feeling pretty down over the last few weeks, which led him to ignore everyone, including his relatives' messages and emails. Just a couple of days ago, he finally checked those messages and saw that people were discussing how unfair it was for our parents to pressure me into giving him a job when they hadn't treated me well. Craig felt really confused since he had been in constant contact with our parents for the last couple of weeks and they hadn't mentioned any family issues. After reading the messages, he confronted them, asking if they had acted in such a way, till they completely denied it and claimed ignorance about the messages. But Craig felt they were lying, prompting him to call me for the truth. He had confided in our parents about his job situation, expressing his distress, but he had never asked me for help. It baffled him why they would involve me in their plans to push him toward a job without him requesting it. After some reflection, I decided to share the truth with him. He deserved to know what our parents had been up to behind his back. I recounted everything they had told me, explaining that they insisted I needed to offer him a job to help him out since he was struggling. I mentioned that perhaps their initial intentions were genuinely supportive, aimed at getting his life back on track, but it eventually devolved into harassment toward me, which I couldn't tolerate. I expressed my condolences regarding his job situation, knowing how much it meant to him and how hard he had worked in his position. It must have been incredibly tough to be laid off, but deep down he knew that we hadn't always gotten along and wouldn't function well together, which was why I had refused my parents' request. He seemed to understand, clarifying that he had no interest in working with me, not out of offense, but simply because he was not in the right mindset to work with anyone, and he was intentionally taking a break. My parents had painted a picture that he had no viable job offers, but the truth was he did have options. He was just choosing to hold off because he wanted a break. It was a personal decision, not a reflection of frustration. He vented to me for a while, which I allowed, even though our relationship wasn't the best anymore. I thought it could be helpful for him. After our conversation, he expressed how upset he was about our parents meddling in his situation, because it made him look desperate and misled people into thinking he was trying to persuade my parents to pressure me into getting him a job. It was all really confusing since he hadn't done anything like that. He mentioned he was going to talk to my parents about it and apologize for everything I'd gone through. I found that really mature of him and felt he had matured a lot over the past 5 years. After losing his job, he seemed to realize that nothing is permanent, which helped him let go of some pride and arrogance. Perhaps it was a hidden lesson for him. While we didn't fully resolve our issues, at least we had a good conversation, and that felt sufficient for me. Update 4: a few days ago, Greg and I had a phone conversation. Afterward, he said he intended to confront our parents about their actions. He followed through, but the discussion didn't go well. My parents became defensive, arguing that they were merely trying to help him, and that taking time for himself wasn't the right approach. He needed to resume the job hunt immediately. This escalated into a heated argument, with Greg accusing them of trying to control his life from the start, and not allowing him to make his own choices, even as an adult. My parents didn't take that well, and started listing everything they had done for him, which were just the normal responsibilities of being a parent. I never understood why they felt the need to boast about it as if it were some great favor. It wasn't a favor, it was their duty. The fight got pretty ugly, and now Greg is no longer speaking to them. And guess who they're blaming for it? You guessed it. I don't understand how I've become the scapegoat for every situation they're in. This time, instead of a direct confrontation, they chose to make a Facebook post about it. Luckily for me, our relatives immediately came to my defense, calling my parents out on their behavior. They reminded my parents of their failures, not just to me but also to Greg, pointing out how they pressured him during such a tough time instead of offering moral and emotional support. After receiving a flood of comments from family, they decided to delete the post and block everyone. In short, they've pretty much been ostracized, and I couldn't be happier about it. As for Greg and me, he has apologized for how he treated me in the past, and we're going to work on rebuilding our relationship. But right now, the most important thing in my life is my wife, and I'm genuinely excited to become a father.
Did you hear? I heard Brad has a secret fear of elevators, so he's been taking the stairs for years and pretends it's just part of his fitness routine.